would like to introduce our next session. This afternoon's session is on maritime decarbonization. My name is Duncan McIntosh, and I am the Senior Regional Maritime Specialist here at ADB. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's session on a very important topic that is very cross-cutting across not only transport, but climate change, regional cooperation and integration, and is very near and dear to all of our hearts. And it's my pleasure to be on stage with such distinguished speakers today. So after the photo, I would like to first just give my brief presentation to set the scene on why maritime trade is of such great importance and why maritime decarbonization is of such critical urgency. So without further ado, I'll just run through a brief presentation of mine before we move on to the sequence of today's great speakers. So I'm ready to, there we are, thank you. So my talk will just give a brief background on the subject before we get into a little more detail from the remaining speakers today. So maritime decarbonization, maritime transport, is critical to global trade and global prosperity. As many of us here may be already familiar, over 90% of global trade volume is carried by sea. By value, that's over 70% of all the cargo in the world is carried by sea. And this is for good reason, because maritime shipping is by far the most efficient mode to carry 1 ton of cargo 1 mile. Compared to a truck, a ship is 10 times more efficient. Compared to air transport, 50 times more efficient. It's over 1.5 times more efficient than a cargo train. And of particular importance to our developing member countries, over 60% of all of that seaborne cargo is loaded and unloaded in developing country ports. And Asia as a region loads and unloads more cargo than any other region. Last year alone, Asia unloaded over 60% of all of the seaborne cargo in the world. Despite being the most efficient mode to move 1 ton of cargo 1 mile, shipping is a dirty transportation mode as it currently stands. The fuel used today, heavy fuel oil, is very carbon intensive. And if shipping were a country, it would be the 6th largest greenhouse gas emitting country, right in between Germany and Japan. Although it emits approximately 3% of the global greenhouse gas emitted in the world, shipping is not accounted for in the Paris Agreement. So not only is shipping a major contributor globally to greenhouse gases and therefore climate change, but those emissions are headed in the wrong direction. Over the last decade alone, shipping emissions have increased by 20%. So the UN body tasked with regulating global shipping, the International Maritime Organization, or the IMO, has released a strategy to tackle greenhouse gas emissions from shipping. And this IMO greenhouse strategy initially targeted the end of the century, 2100, to achieve net zero, making it far incompatible with the goals of the Paris Agreement. Fortunately, last year in July, the IMO revised this greenhouse gas strategy to bring the net zero target up to 2050, much more in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And the blue line you see in this plot is the business as usual scenario, whereby shipping emissions will continue to rise without intervention. According to the new strategy that was agreed upon by the countries at the IMO, we now have a target of net zero by 2050 with indicative checkpoints at 2030 to achieve 20% reduction, and by 2040 to achieve a 70% reduction. Now, keeping in mind that 2030 is just around the corner, this spurs urgent necessary action and investment. So the challenge to finance this type of investment is huge. It's estimated approximately $1.9 trillion will be needed to achieve net zero in global shipping by 2050. Interestingly, 87% of that investment will be needed in the land-based infrastructure and the fuel production facilities. This is an upfront expense and, of course, a new type of investment, so it may not be readily supported by traditional maritime financing instruments. And this points to a need for us to accelerate pathways for zero carbon bunker fuels. And this can not only enable industry to make confident long-term investments, but we can also support our DMCs to adapt port infrastructure to climate change. Along with these challenges come some great opportunities. So it's worth pointing out that the future fuels currently being considered for zero carbon shipping, whether ammonia, whether hydrogen, whether methanol, they are all at a minimum 2.5 times less energy dense than the current fossil fuels that are being used. This means that ships will require more frequent bunkering stops. This opens the door for the potential to establish new bunkering hubs in our DMCs that could yield large economic benefits. Additionally, investing in port infrastructure to decarbonize the maritime industry, we can also invest in port resilience to climate change at the same time. And it's been estimated we can achieve a 4-to-1 return on that type of investment. We can fast track the electrification of port operations and provide shore power access. And this can even be done prior to committing capital to develop additional renewable energy capacity. That's a step we can take today. It's also worth noting that of all of that cargo that I mentioned is carried by sea, 40% is energy related. So ports must stand at the nexus of the next energy transition. They already stand at a critical point in today's energy supply chains. Therefore, decarbonization of the sector will depend on the development of e-fuels at or near ports, and ports should take on a leadership role as first movers in this transition. And this can be done not only by investing in the future e-fuel development, production, supply, export, but also by establishing green corridors or carbon-free shipping routes. ADB is looking at taking a programmatic approach to develop a flagship initiative in this space. We would like to do a number of initiatives in a coordinated approach to tackle not only greening of our DMC's ports, but also supporting the global initiative to decarbonize this sector. So some of the things we can do include ensuring a just transition with financial and technical support to vulnerable shipping-reliant DMCs, especially small island developing states, those that are most affected by the energy transition costs and the rising shipping costs that will be associated with more expensive fuels in the future. We can fast-track the implementation of electrification and smart and digital solutions at DMC ports for improved efficiency and reduced greenhouse gas emissions. And the speaker who will follow me, Dr. Yesham Elhan Kalahar, will speak more detail about that. We can promote RCI, or regional cooperation and integration, for the harmonization of regional green shipping policies that give attention to the needs of vulnerable DMCs to enable a level playing field and to minimize uncertainty. And we'll also hear more about RCI from our speakers that will follow me. We can also support the development of green corridors, as I mentioned, those designated routes for sustainable vessels that include our DMCs. We can build partnerships with the private sector and industry stakeholders to foster knowledge sharing and collaboration. We can enable DMCs to decarbonize their domestic fleets, whether harbor craft, fishing fleets, inter-island ferries, or inland waterway vessels can all be decarbonized and in some cases electrified. We'll hear about an ADB project working on this as well today. We also must ensure that the workforce is adequately trained in the use of alternative fuels and related shipboard systems. And finally, we need to pay attention to that incredible financing challenge. And one of the proposed solutions may include the establishment of a new multi-donor fund at ADB, which could look something like a new Green Ports and Maritime Decarbonization Fund. So some of the work we've done looking into this possibility started last year when ADB commissioned a study to assess the financing landscape for green port and maritime decarbonization investments in DMCs. And while we found that there are a range of existing funding and financing initiatives, you can see the long list on the right-hand side of this slide, none focus on green ports and maritime decarbonization. Therefore, there is the potential to establish a new fund in this space that could be the pioneer Green Ports and Maritime Decarbonization Fund for the Asia-Pacific region. So some of the stakeholder engagement that we did along the way to develop a business case for this type of a financing instrument involved stakeholder engagement across our DMC port operators. We went to 4 site visits, we did virtual interviews with 8, and we surveyed over 24 ports, including 14 financing facilities that were mentioned on the previous page. And what we heard from the port stakeholders overwhelmingly was that the main obstacle to investing in green ports and maritime decarbonization was the lack of availability of funding and financing. We also estimated that at a minimum, the current financing gap stands at over $10 billion in just the next 5 years in our DMCs alone. So what we've done so far in looking at the financing landscape started last year with the study that assessed the gaps, and then we've held a couple of knowledge sharing workshops starting in July of last year in Shanghai. We finalized the business case for this proposed new fund in December. Just last March of this year, we held our second workshop in Singapore, where again we brought together DMC stakeholders with experts in port greening and maritime decarbonization to share knowledge. And then this week, we consider this session a soft launch of this broader flagship ADB initiative into this space. And we're aiming to make an official announcement at this year's UNFCCC COP in Azerbaijan this year in November. So watch this space, because we do hope that in the maritime decarbonization space, ADB will be able to make an official announcement with some of our partners that are interested in forming a coalition with us. On the idea of what a fund may look like, were ADB to go ahead with this, is proposed that while it could support both sovereign and non-sovereign, the types of investments would be mostly on the non-sovereign side as a supplement to our regular country pipeline. And these types of financial support could be very much modally agnostic. That is, they could include loans, equity, grants, and guarantees. And the area where they may intervene will be upstream, midstream, and downstream, but because most of this is in the nascent stage, it's envisioned that a lot of the work needs to start upstream. And by upstream, we're talking about governance type interventions, such as support for development of green port policies at the port, terminal, or even at the national level. At the midstream intervention level, we can do those types of TAs where we support feasibility studies and the like. And then finally, at the downstream level, we can start to put hard infrastructure on the ground. And this is where we can retrofit energy efficiency at the port, and we can even invest in those big ticket items like bunkering and producing future fuels at or near ports. So I would like to thank you very much for your kind attention, and I would ask to hold questions until our next speaker, who is joining us virtually. So before I hand over the floor, please allow me to introduce Dr. Yesham Elhan Kayalar, who is the advisor to the chief economist in the Economic Research and Development Impact Department here at ADB. Dr. Yesham, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Duncan. Good afternoon, esteemed guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It is a true privilege and a pleasure to join this August group and share some of the findings from our applied work on maritime decarbonization, focusing on near-term solutions in ports as part of the global, regional, and national transport and trade networks for sustainable growth. Next, please. The COVID-19 pandemic made it very clear how much of our economies and lives depend on efficient ports, even for those of us who had not been working in or with the maritime industry. The numbers were very convincing and compelling. Shipping is an integral part of trade, as we've heard earlier, and it has been a steadily growing industry. In the last 3 decades, cargo carried by sea has nearly tripled in volume, growing to over 11 billion tons. And the merchant fleet capacity has kept pace with this growth, growing by more than 43% to about 2.1 million deadweight tons of cargo being carried around. And this trajectory is expected to continue. Maritime helps move over 80% of global cargo and accounts for 3% of GHG emissions, as we've heard earlier. Within the transport sector alone, it is the 3rd largest contributor to GHG emissions, right after personal vehicles and trucks. 9 of the largest container ports in the world by volume of operations worldwide are in Asia. Rankings hold if we expand the sample to 20 largest ports, 14 of them are in Asia. Asia moves or sends out 64% of all containerized cargo transported via vessels. So the top 3 vessel producers, shipping companies, are also in Asia. Whatever happens in maritime or shipping, Asia has a very integral role to play worldwide. The ports, ship producers, and the volume of cargo being transported in Asia speak for themselves. What about the efficiency? What about the efficiency of the ports in terms of the throughput levels and waiting times at anchor and berth? While assessing the optimal means of supporting recovery and growth in the wake of the pandemic, we noted that ports with smart systems, particularly, were not as severely impacted with the mobility restrictions and the system disruptions we've seen during the pandemic. And they bounced back to pre-pandemic levels of productivity much faster than the ones that were not using smart systems. Next slide, please. The slide before that, please. Yes, thank you. Using Container Port Call Database, we analyzed container vessel calls across a sample of leading 53 Asia-Pacific ports. These ports were, in terms of volume, the largest, in fact, globally, or they were the gateway ports, the main lifelines of their respective countries and the countries not only that housed them, but the countries around those. As seen in the left-hand panel, vessel waiting times increased from mid-2020 onwards due to the pandemic, and the impact of COVID is still visible across the region, but waiting delays are not evenly distributed across regional ports. If we look at waiting times by port in the right-hand panel, large ports appear to have more port delays and waiting time. But when we adjust for size of operations, measured in millions of TEUs, containers, We get an indication that ports with more smart system integration, such as Busan and Singapore, are more efficient with less waiting times. And ports with the highest average waiting time per 1,000 TEU port throughput have lower levels of smart port system uptake. Examples include Bangkok, Chittagong, and Manila. Next slide, please. We also canvassed the uptake levels of smart port systems among the selected 53 ports in the Asia-Pacific region. Progress has been robust, in fact, but level of uptake and absorption capacity vary across the region. In general, ports with highest uptake of smart port systems, again, Singapore and Busan examples come to mind, report a lower average waiting time as we've seen before. While most ports have automated gates, they have terminal operating systems, so about 3 to 4 of the top 6 smart systems. Only a small number of them have implemented truck appointment systems, which is an important linkage to the logistics network and the urban transport networks from the port. These can help reduce queuing of trucks outside the terminal, alleviating some of the pressure that we see from the ports on the neighboring urban settled areas. Fewer ports, in fact, still have upgraded their vessel traffic systems to support just-in-time arrivals, which is one of the factors, one of the systems that can help decrease waiting times at the port. Port asset use intensity could be improved with the inclusion of the system, and also help support the supply chain within the country and, of course, the global value chain through the export-import trade routes. Next slide, please. To assess the emission-saving potential from including this just-in-time system, we have run case studies in 3 selected countries. We've compared ports at the high, medium, and low end of the spectrum in terms of smart systems uptake, efficiency, and size. So we have Busan at 22 million TEU, which is at about number 10 in the 53 port sample in terms of technological uptake, representing a high case of adoption of technology. We have Colombo and Sri Lanka at about the mid-level of the sample, handling about 7 million TEU with average pre-berth waiting per call times of about hours, 0.2 days, as you see on the sample here. And Chittagong, which places at the lower end of the sample in terms of technological uptake, which is a major port in Bangladesh and critical to the national economy and its immediate hinterland, handling about 3 million TEU with an average of 1.7 days of pre-berth waiting time per call. Next slide, please. We analyzed the inbound voyages to these 3 ports and explored the impact reducing inbound vessel speed would have on waiting time and consequently greenhouse gas emissions. We found that time savings and by extension, lower emissions and cost savings for cargo owners, vessel and port operators, and logistics companies can be quite significant. Because maritime is a linear industry, in the sense that every vessel makes multiple port calls. Accordingly, inefficiencies downstream or upstream at any point from a given port, no matter how technologically advanced it is, has an impact on every port along the port call route. So we can see that even in the most technologically advanced case that we're reviewing here, Busan, there is an opportunity to save up to 128 days when we manage the speed during the voyage, so voyage optimization, decreasing the emissions from the at the port from these waiting times. And when we look at countries with lower technological adoption levels, the impact is much bigger and much more pronounced. we can look at up to 32,000 tons equivalent of carbon dioxide equivalent savings and 946 days of savings with the voyage and port optimization that just-in-time software system can bring in. A software system and a smart system that can actually be attained for less than $10 million per port of a port of this size. Next slide, please. Allow me to leave you with 3 points for consideration. Direct benefits of productive ports are clear. They better support the supply chain in the hinterland as well as the global value chains. They support sustainable growth and improved environmental metrics. But the co-benefits follow closely. In our region, many of our ports are right next to our large urban and peri-urban areas. In Manila, we have observed often over the last 15 years that whenever there's a congestion at the port, we feel it in the city traffic. The pollution in the port, we feel it in the city. In our region, less congestion, traffic and pollution at the port would directly translate to less traffic in the neighboring cities, better air quality, and urban connectivity. Not to mention the benefits from sustainable trade and for the environment. Secondly, decarbonization in an industry with shifting baselines and targets require collaborative action from all stakeholders. Collaboration can, in fact, support competitiveness in this interconnected industry. There is always a consideration in terms of sharing data, in terms of sharing business intelligence in a highly competitive industry like shipping and maritime, including in ports through port operators and different stakeholders. However, by focusing on not what to share, but sharing how we approach in addressing different issues that are common to us all and how best to achieve the common goal of decarbonization and sustainable growth could be mutually beneficial for all the stakeholders. Finally, we have to start implementing near-term smart solutions, which are in fact complementary to net zero emission targets we aim to achieve in medium and long term. There is no single pathway to development in our region. All countries and economies are unique with unique opportunities that can facilitate decarbonization. But we all have to take that first step and do it together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yesham. For our audience members, for posting questions to our panelists and our speakers today, we're using the Events Air app. I believe there's a QR code. I don't know if we can put it on the screen, but I believe everybody has seen the QR code, and that's where we'll field all the questions. So as our speakers present today and you have questions, please enter them into the Events Air app. And then after our final speaker, we will have a panel discussion whereby the moderator will get to the questions from the Events Air app. So please, as you think of questions, feel free to use the app and put your questions directly into the Events Air app. And now it's my pleasure to introduce, there's the QR code. Okay, so I'll give you a second if perhaps you haven't seen it yet. This is the app that we're using to ask questions, and the moderator will be able to field questions directly from the app after our last speaker. So it's my pleasure now to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Sin-Young Park. And Dr. Park is the Director of the Regional Cooperation and Integration and Trade Division here at ADB. Sin-Young, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Well, today I'm going to talk about the net zero pathways and the role of trade and trade policies. So, well, trade has been a major driver of growth and poverty reduction in developing countries, including those in Asia. And driven by these important economic activity, the transportation has been also part of the really rapid growing sector. And as you can see in the slide, Asia is now emitting about half of global carbon emissions every year. And that share has been growing quite fast. If we compute these carbon emissions based on production, in 2018, you can compare these production-based carbon emission by industry between world and Asia. And you notice that in manufacturing sector in Asia, as well as the utilities, account for larger share in Asia. And that is really driven by the trade activities. Manufacturing sector in Asia has been growing fast, driven by trade-related activities, also within the region through the deepening of supply chain. And the share of manufacturing and then utilities in production-based carbon emission is much larger in Asia compared to the world. Asia is a net exporter of carbon emissions. So the lines, two lines, the dark blue shows that the solid line is demand-based, the carbon emission, and then the dotted line is production. So that actually shows Asia's production-based carbon emission actually exceeds the demand-based carbon emission. So Asia produces actually more carbon emission than it demands. On the other hand, if you look at the non-Asia, it shows that the demand-based, the carbon emission is actually higher than the production base, which means they are importing their carbon emissions. This shows more or less the same as Asia also makes a lot of progress in terms of reducing the carbon intensity in their industries and sectors. You can see that the carbon embedded in exports is actually declining quite substantially. It has declined in the between like 2008 and 2011, but it has maintained fairly stable. Asia's carbon emission embodied in exports are shown by region and then exports in these charts. You can see the carbon embodied in exports in Asia across the different sub-regions, especially East Asia, represented. It's actually reflecting a rapid growth in China, the orange color, and then the ones in Southeast Asia, Southeast Asia have expanded quite significantly. And the carbon emissions embodied in exports also show the manufacturing sector account for nearly 3/4 of total carbon emissions. And here you also see that the transportation services is quite significant given the importance of transportation in exports. Asia is the importing those carbon emissions within the region and then also export to the region. So intra-regional carbon trade is actually quite significant. And this shows that the carbon emissions are really driven by the industrial structure. The export-oriented growth model with the manufacturing sector has been a major driver of carbon emissions. And it also shows that there's a possibility of the carbon leakage, that the Asia is actually emitting carbon more when we are computing these carbon emission based on the production as opposed to consumption. So the region actually, creates more carbon emission from the production than it sort of like consumes. And that shows up in the carbon balance. Many countries in the regions are net carbon exporters, especially like you look at the China is large net exporters, followed by India, Singapore, Korea, Malaysia, etc. So in order to prevent the carbon leakage, there are some tax or the tariff measures countries can consider. And recently, the EU introduced this carbon border adjustment mechanism. This imposed a levy on carbon-intensive products in 6 sectors that are imported into EU. This is really based on the difference in the carbon prices, that the EU tend to have a higher carbon prices compared to other regions, but those high carbon prices will result in the carbon leakage if the non-EU countries have a much lower carbon prices. And if the EU actually effectively adjust the carbon price differences by CBAM, this carbon border adjustment mechanism, then theoretically it's going to it's kind of like having the result of equalizing the carbon price between the EU production and non-EU production. So this is an important landmark to prevent carbon leakage by putting an established tariff fee on carbon emissions driven by the different carbon prices. And we'll still have to see how that's going to affect all other countries. Our preliminary assessment actually suggests that the impact of CBAM on Asia is not going to be very significant because the EU is not really the major export destinations from Asia, surprisingly, and especially for these 6 sectors that they are imposing. Having said that, there are still still possibility of other regions to follow suit and introduce a similar kind of like the carbon border adjustment, or EU can also expand these CBAM coverage to other sectors. So going beyond these 6 sectors, which we could actually go into substantial kind of like the production, the manufacturing sector in Asia, that could have some impact on Asian economies. Still, some of the economies with specific sectors, such as fertilizers in Georgia, some Central Asian economies, also the electricity, like and steel in South Asia, India, and steel industries, Japan, Korea, they would still be they could still see some impact. So what are the policy tools to consider? The trade is a very important economic sector which has not been fully incorporated in the NDC formulation. If we mainstream trade and then trade policy into NDC, it could substantially increase the NDC ambitions as well as accelerate the achievement of NDC. The authorities can reduce tariffs and trade restrictions on environmental goods and services that could facilitate the more green trade. And third, promote transfer of technology. Fourth, accelerate trade facilitation and logistics reforms. Earlier, Yasim also mentioned there's delays at port that could contribute greater carbon emissions. Similarly, other studies show delays at border crossing or more efficient logistics could contribute. Inefficient logistics could contribute greater carbon emissions. So having that reforms to accelerate the trade facilitation and increase the efficiency in logistics help reduce carbon emissions. Develop national carbon pricing strategies and strengthen regional carbon market cooperation. There are carbon leakage currently, and the EU measures show that if you do not have the nationally binding carbon price, there's a chance that the revenues or there's actually the carbon tax or tariff at border could add to the revenues of the countries that are imposing these tax and tariff. So if the countries in the region introduce our own carbon price, that could actually reorient those carbon tariff and then tax revenues to domestic use. And finally, strengthen international cooperation. Many of these trade measures do require the international cooperation, collaboration in terms of the harmonized rules and standards, and that would help reduce the carbon emissions together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Park. Now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Yang Liu. Dr. Liu is a transport specialist here at ADB. Dr. Liu, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, guests and colleagues. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to present one of our ADB projects in the port and shipping sector. So this project is in Anhui province in People's Republic of China. As actually presented in the morning, ADB transport sector heavily focusing on the road sector in the past, and gradually shifting to the railway sector, considering the potential of the climate change benefit. Now we are also kind of started to get more involved in the port and the shipping sector to find out opportunity to decarbonize this sector. So we see this a great opportunity here, and we're trying to gradually get more involved. So my today's presentation will basically focus on the overview and detailed component of this project, and also share some highlights on the green and smart port development. Because the time is quite limited, so I will go a bit briefly, and if you have any questions or interest, feel free to reach out to me after the presentation. Thank you. Our ADB project normally have basically the physical component and some soft component. This project is also the same. We will focus on the construction of 3 ports within the province. And also the second component which we are having great interest is try to demonstrate some clean energy container vessel and also the development of the shipping routes. in the development of the first two components, we'll focus on the promotion of green and smart port and shipping development. Of course, lastly, we will try to incorporate more institutional capacity building and knowledge sharing events. My today's presentation will focus only on the first three components, as this project is still in the initial stage. So the careful design of the last component is still undergoing. Basically, this is the map of the province. This is Anhui province. It's in the middle towards the eastern side of China. There's actually two big rivers across this province. One is the Huai River, as shown on the map. And the other one is the Yangtze River. It's actually a much bigger river. In the past, these two rivers are not effectively connected. So if you want to go for a very efficient inland waterway transport, you have to go to another province and then come back to the own province. But in 2023, which is last year, this Jianghuai Canal finally opened after many years' effort. Now, basically, the entire inland waterway network in the province is quite well connected and also creates an opportunity for the inland waterway shipping instead of using other more traditional modes like the road transport. So in our project, we will focus on one port in the Wuhu Sanshan port. This port actually is on the right bank of the Yangtze River, very close to the Wuhu Yangtze River second bridge. Another one is in the capital city of this province. It's Hefei. It's a Hefei Paihe International Logistic Park port, which is a phase 2. The phase 1 is already under operation. This one is right on the left bank of the Paihe River, which is also part of the Jianghuai Canal, and about 14 kilometers upstream of the Chao Lake. And the third one is this Luan Huoqiu Port Zhouji Wharf. This one is on the right bank of the Huai River, about 91 kilometers upstream of this Jianghuai Canal. So from this map, you can see we are actually focusing on the entire inland waterway network within the province. And the last part is our clean energy container shipping. So this route actually connecting the capital city Hefei to the hub port Wuhu on the Yangtze River through this Jianghuai Canal and Chao Lake, and eventually Yangtze River. So the one-way distance of this route is about 145 kilometers. It's a bit technical things. I'll go a bit briefly. So this Wuhu port, we try to construct 3 berths, which can accommodate 10,000 tons ship, because it's on the Yangtze River, so the capacity is on the higher side. And the design capacity is for the brick bulk cargo is 2.8 million tons per year, and container cargo is 400,000 TEUs. The shoreline will occupy 480 meters. The estimated project cost is roughly 191 million. One specially designed feature is here we also accommodate Class 9 dangerous goods. We have one container stocking yard designed for that. Basically, it's more or less for the batteries. And the Hefei port, because the limited area, so we actually go a bit expanded shoreline. It's 8 berths, which accommodate 2,000 tons ship. So the brick bulk cargo is 1 million tons per year, and container cargo is 450,000 TEUs. Here we actually accommodate the automobile. The design capacity is 100,000 cars per year. So it's occupy a bit longer shorelines, above 800 meters. Here, one highlight is the 8th berth is a ro-ro berth, basically designed for import and export of the automobile. So basically, when the cars get loaded to the container, it can go to the Wuhu port and then transshipment to a bit larger vessels and go directly to the Shanghai port and then sent overseas. And here also we have 6 parking lots designed for this ro-ro berth for all these vehicles. The last one actually is on the northern side of the province. We also designed 8 berths with 2,000 tons capacity. Here we are focusing more on the brick cargo and the bulk cargo. and with a project cost and roughly over 100 million. This is actually the clean energy container shipping route. We're trying to support the procurement of 8 purely battery-powered vessels with a capacity of 120 TEUs. We're looking at the target of deploy them from 2025 to 2029. And this is actually the situation is quite unique to develop this battery shipping because it's mostly standstill water, and we can maintain a relatively constant power output and without additional battery consumption. And also the distance is quite moderate, it can be covered with the current battery technology. There's a few highlights on the green and smart port development. So first is this Shell power facility will be provided for the vessel to charge themselves. And also the utilization will be monitored and shared and within the network. Second part is for all the loading and unloading facilities of all this equipment, we'll try to go for the electrified energy efficient equipment and also explore the way to recover the energy during the operation. Of course, for the electricity, if you directly go for the grid, it's still not purely clean energy. So we try to go for a bit more clean energy. One to be explored, of course, is PV panel on the rooftop. And also we're trying to explore also on the parking lot, we create a certain kind of shelf, and also we can have the PV panel on top of it. And also we try to, of course, if the situation allows, to explore the wind power, but maybe not within somewhere in the city center, but a bit rural port, and to increase the coverage of the green electricity to the port. And of course, all this equipment and even the vehicles used within the port, we try to explore the way to electrify them, and also providing charging facilities to promote the use of maybe some LNG and CNG trucks near the port area. One thing we can further explore is, of course, the multi-modal transportation system to combine the usage of the rail and the port to reduce our reliance on the traditional road transport system, which can first reduce the logistics cost and, of course, also reducing the carbon emission. On the smart side, since the time is limited, I will briefly talk about it. Basically, we try to further enhance the level of automation within the port. Like, two examples, we can consider this remote controlled loading and unloading, and also some fully automated, this rear-mounted gantry crane, which can significantly increase operational efficiency. So that's all my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Liu. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our last speaker of the afternoon. Mr. Taniguchi Masanobu-san is a research fellow at the Japan Transport and Tourism Research Institute. Taniguchi-san, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction, Mr. Duncan. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Taniguchi, Research Fellow of the Japan Transport and Tourism Institute. Let me introduce our organization before starting my presentation. JTTRI is an independent non-profit organization founded with the support of government, industry, and academia. For over 50 years since its foundation, JTTRI has contributed to the development of the administration, businesses, and industries of transport and tourism, and the progress of academic research in these fields. And we organize some symposium and seminar. So please check our website if you have an interest of our activities. Today, I am grateful for the opportunity to present our research studies on decarbonization in international shipping.
Aim it towards this wall.
Oh, okay. Please wait for a moment.
Apologies, bear with us for a moment while we get the presentation back on screen, please. They have it back there. Let me go talk. You can. Sorry.
Okay. Okay. Let's start my presentation. This slide and the next slide are introductions. As other speakers mentioned, demand for the international shipping is expected to continuously increase. But GHG emissions from international shipping is separated from the national determined contributions. Therefore, IMO have developed strategies for the decarbonization in shipping industries. Particularly, the IMO adopted the 2023 IMO GHG strategy in July of last year, aiming to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. This slide shows image of marine fuel transition. To achieve carbon neutrality in the maritime sector, it is essential to transition maritime fuels from heavy fuel oil to zero-emission fuels, such as hydrogen, methanol, ammonia, and so others. In preparation for the forthcoming era of significant fuel transition, like the shift from coal to oil in the past, research and development projects on low or zero carbon fueled ships are underway. It is important to note that there are several candidate fuels, and it is uncertain whether any one fuel will become dominant. Here is a list of our research studies related to decarbonization. We are studying various areas such as international aviation, international shipping, domestic transportation. Today, I will introduce two research studies, specifically focusing on decarbonization in international shipping. The first is a research study on alternative fuel for ships. Various fuels are currently under consideration, but when accounting for GHG emissions over the life cycle, emission intensity varies depending on the manufacturing process and materials, even for the same type of fuel. This difference was quantitatively demonstrated by estimating the GHG intensity of various fuels considering the supply chain in a specific project. The left graph shows well-to-tank emissions, and the right graph shows well-to-wake emissions. Blue is hydrogen, and green is ammonia. Hydrogen and ammonia are promising zero-emission fuels, but this study has found that even hydrogen and ammonia from the same production process may emit more GHGs than using fuel oils, depending on the GHG intensity of the grid electricity. These results contributed to the discussion on the IMO's LCA guidelines. Additionally, we organized an international seminar with the EU, Norway, Australia, and the IMO in February 2022. The second is a research study about possible fuel carbon intensity regulations for international shipping, discussing in the IMO. We analyzed and assessed quantitatively the impact of fuel transition by possible GHG fuel intensity regulations. Specifically, we developed a simulation program to calculate the trajectory of fuel transition aimed at achieving the 2023 IMO GHG strategy for the international maritime industry. We established several scenarios, including variations in shipping demand, alternative fuel supply, and hypothetical GHG fuel intensity threshold, resulting in a total of 24 simulation scenarios. Left side graph shows the results of example, fuel consumption and GHG emissions. Green is ammonia, yellow is methanol, orange is methane, and the blue is heavy oil fuels. On the right side shows fuel types of ships built every year. Color is same as fuel consumption. So yellow is methanol, green is ammonia, and orange is methane or LNG. It is important to note that certain conditions were imposed, such as the exclusion of carbon capture and storage, and no early replacements, among others. However, the simulation results revealed that only a few scenarios met the requirements of the 2023 IMO GHG strategy. In addition, the findings unveiled several potential pathways to achieving the goals outlined in the strategy. For instance, the implementation of a compliance mechanism was found to be effective. Additionally, the simulation suggested that transitioning to zero emission for all delivered ships post-2030 could be a crucial step. Furthermore, the results indicate that relying on a single fuel source is unlikely to be pragmatic. These results were submitted to the MEPC 81st at IMO as an information paper for consideration in the drafting of the GHG fuel standard. Finally, this is for your information. These are our new research study on decarbonization. The upper study focuses on the decarbonization of the transport sector, including land vehicles, railways, shipping, and aviation in Japan. We are concerned that the transport sector might require more support from the government or investment to decarbonize compared to other sectors. The lower study focuses on hydrogen as a fuel for transport sector in Japan. Hydrogen as a fuel is often regarded as the fuel of the future, but we are considering that there are preparations we may need to undertake now to facilitate the widespread adoption of hydrogen fuel in Japan by 2050. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope that my awkward presentation contributes to today's discussion in some way. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to say thank you very much to our speakers who joined us on stage, and also thank you to our speaker Yesham, who's joining us virtually today. We have, let's see, approximately 18 minutes remaining, with which we would like to do an open panel discussion with our audience, with our panelists who presented, and of course with our virtual panelist, Yesham. So I'll start with looking at the app. I see we did get a few questions come through on the app, and please feel free to send some. If you're having any trouble with the app, of course, you're welcome to raise a hand, and I can pass a mic. We can also do some live Q&A, but we just like to stimulate an interactive discussion at this point. So I see a question here that looks like it's directed towards Yesham. So Yesham, the question is, doing a calculation on potential GHG reduction by alleviating sail fast then wait practices is one thing, but how does ADB intend to receive buy-in from the stakeholders to make it reality?
Thank you for that excellent question. Let me take off my earphones so I don't listen to myself as well in the feedback. That is an excellent question. Yes, we have one of the key elements that we are working with at the moment is leveraging our convening power to look at all the different stakeholders' viewpoints and to identify where their drivers are, whether they're commercial or SDG targets, GHG emission targets, baseline profits, bottom line profit targets. The important thing is that we can leapfrog technology very quickly now. A lot of the technology and the smart systems that I've mentioned in the presentation are available much more readily and cost effectively. The important thing is the main driver for those smart systems is participation and collaboration. There is a very strong commercial driver for the shipping lines, cargo owners, and the ship owners to not hurry up and wait, right? Hurry up, increased emissions during voyage. They come to the port and wait at pre-berth because they cannot, in fact, approach the berth and then dock and unload. So there's a very strong commercial driver for them to share that information in a data pool where these just-in-time systems can work. From the perspective of the port operator, sometimes it's argued that port operators are not that keen to get rid of the congestion at the port because they make money from demurrage. However, there's also a very strong case for the port operators who are making money from faster turnaround as well. And now increasingly, there's vertical integration that we see in the industry from the shipping lines to port operation to logistics chains. And they do serve clients. Operators also serve the clients of the shipping lines, cargo owners, as well as the logistics companies. So there's an incentive for them to also be part of this data sharing, information pooling for more optimal results. Similarly, on the logistics end, there is a keen interest from the logistics companies, some of which are already integrated into the operation and the shipping lines, port operation and shipping lines, to share information so they actually know when the vessel is coming. They know when the yard will release the cargo and how quickly they can actually load, and a system that works with truck booking systems ahead of time with automated gates, so they don't have to deal with a lot of paperwork and wait at the gate, and quickly get back on the road and complete the logistics chain route that they're meant to. So as long as we look at the primary drivers and the incentives of the different stakeholders with clarity and act with intention, we're hopeful that this will in fact move forward.
Thank
Hope that
you.
addresses the question. I'm happy to add more should there be other questions.
Thanks very much. I see another question here for Yang Lu about the Anhui project. And the question is, how was that project financed by ADB?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I forgot to mention, this project actually was proposed to be financed by ADB, I think sometime last year. So we're still in the project preparation phase. The project financing is considered to be 200 million from ADB side. Of course, the project is much larger scope. So of course, our there'll be some counterpart financing provided by our executing agency and the implementing agency. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Yang Lu. I have a question here that may be directed for Taniguchi-san about fuels. And the question is, what is your take on liquefied natural gas, LNG, as an alternative fuel for maritime transport?
Thank you for the question. As you mentioned, LNG is a very important fuel for shipping, but also it is a transition fuels. So now shipping industry take effort to convert their ships to LNG fuels, and in the view of the technical side, the LNG ships can consume the methane fuels. So I believe the LNG fueled vessels convert to the methane fueled vessels. Thank you.
Thank you. That is all the questions I'm seeing on the app. So if there is any audience member, and if you have a question and have any issues dealing with the app, please feel free to raise a hand and we can bring a mic over. If there are any additional questions in the room, we'd be happy to field them. Otherwise, I have some other questions that I'll go ahead with. So if anything comes to mind and you would like to ask a live question, please feel free to raise a hand or use the app. And I have a question here for Sin Young, and that is, what opportunities and challenges are facing Asia in leveraging trade and trade policies to facilitate a shift towards a low-carbon economy?
Thanks. Well, the trade is contributing nearly 30%, actually more than 30% of global carbon emission. So if we do not really green the trade and then throughout the entire supply chain, achieving the green transition is going to be very difficult. The current challenge the world faces is actually the significant geoeconomic fragmentation, trade tensions, which are also delaying the course for energy transition. Everything that we are talking about, like in terms of the renewable energy and then shifting to alternative the fuel, even for the shipping, any transportation, that requires the world to substantially upscale the production of the renewable and being able to efficiently mobilize the most efficient way of producing these renewable energy. And generally, given the differences in the carbon price and still the barriers through the trade of the renewable energy and environmental goods and services, those are actually barriers to a transition to low carbon economy. There's some policy recommendations that I already listed, but it's important to liberalize and remove trade restrictions on environmental goods and services. To do so, actually, we need to have more harmonized definition agreement on what constitutes the environments and goods and services. The topology is an important area. We also need to facilitate the trade, reduce the delays in ports and the border crossing, and also make the logistics very efficient to reduce the carbon emissions coming from these inefficient transportation and then logistics. And together, we also need to collaborate in terms of where to invest and how to invest most efficiently in terms of promoting the green investment on the renewables and the materials for energy transition, even critical minerals. Those are going to be very important in terms of how we are going to also seize the opportunities rising from the energy transition. Thank you.
Thank you, Sin Young. I see another question popped up on the app, and it may be one that multiple panelists would like to take a stab at. It's probably a more complex question to answer, and I'll read it. The question is, how can we factor in and quantify the benefits and the co-benefits of maritime decarbonization, particularly building new ports, in the computation of economic benefits, economic internal rate of return? So it seems like a complicated question, but from my perspective, we've already pointed out that global trade, as Sin Young has pointed out, is critical to global prosperity. And maritime shipping is far and away the most efficient mode of trading goods anywhere around the world. So if we don't decarbonize maritime shipping, we cannot achieve the global climate change goals, including the Paris Agreement. So quantifying the benefits or the hazards of not addressing climate change involves that ecosystem service quantification, which there are natural resource economists who specialize in that. So I think to calculate the IRR of greening shipping, you probably need to quantify the benefits or the hazards of not achieving the climate goals that would happen if we don't. And there is no better means to move goods around the world than by sea. So quite a complicated, especially building new ports is part of the question. And building new ports is not necessarily a requirement to decarbonize the sector, but ports will continue to be built, ports will be rehabilitated, and infrastructure will be needed to accommodate the bunkering and the production and the exporting of the future fuels. So ports will definitely be at the nexus of this energy transition. Maritime shipping is not going away. The fuel that they currently use is extremely dirty, and it's a byproduct of refining petroleum. So it's very cheap. All of these future fuels that we heard Taniguchi-san describe are much more expensive. So that's going to come with an added cost. So how do we justify that added cost? That's the challenge as I see it. And maybe Sin Young has some other thoughts.
Well, not other thoughts, but I think the key to actually quantifying these benefits effectively is understanding the social cost of carbon. Right now, the world is not really paying appropriate price for carbon because there's actually no universal the cost or price of carbon. Where we sit actually have a different carbon price. So there's not a the kind of consensus or in a way some sort of like a global agreement how much we have to pay for the carbon, and that itself, that we are not really paying for the carbon that's a byproduct of every sort of like the human sort of economic activity, makes us use the carbon, consume the carbon more than what we need, what we should be, and then what we need to. And that actually compromises our, I think compromises our efforts to achieve the green transition. If the carbon prices are appropriately computed and then actually considered in the investment and an IRR, then that's going to also promote the investment in these shipping or any like energy transition, any of the the economic activity that's going to help us achieve the climate goals. So really the priority should be like having kind of like the global consensus understanding of social cost of carbon. How do we price the carbon appropriately, and have the national pricing mechanism, and then global and then regional pricing through the carbon markets. Thanks.
Thank you,
Duncan,
Senora.
could I add to that?
Yes, please. Please.
Thank you. Excellent points by both Duncan and Sin-Yong. One point I'd like to share is that before immediately going to building new ports, the asset use intensity is quite low across Asia when we look at different sizes of ports. We've got about 1,700 ports, sea, lake, river, inland, not to mention all the dry ports that also feed to them. And across the board, on average, we're not at 80, 85 range, with the exception of some of the top most efficient ports that we see across the board. So first of all, we can do a lot more with what we have before building additional ports. That's one element. Secondly, we have to look at ports as an integral part, but only a part of the entire economic value chain. They facilitate transport of goods, they facilitate trade, they support local economy, international trade, fantastic. But their effectiveness adds to the effectiveness of logistics as well. By the products that they facilitate the transfer of, they support the local economy, different manufacturing and industries in those sectors. The idea is, how do we calculate the internal rate of return of any other infrastructure investment? We look at what are the value addition in terms of additional products, additional value of the product itself, and how it links to the rest of the economy. A similar approach with the ports would hold through as well. In terms of the GHG emissions, we also have very clear examples, demonstrated examples of how we calculate for a given tonnage, size, type of engine, type and number of years of a vessel, how much they emit normally, and what that would translate to in terms of, we know the wind movements, we know the proximity of the settlements around the ports, industrial segments as well as settlements. So we know what kind of an impact that additional GHG emission would have on the lives of the people living close to the ports. So essentially, it's not an unknown product at all. But the idea is we have to look at ports not as a new area to look at because we haven't looked at it before. We have to look at it in the context of the entire economy and what the ports add or can hinder vis-a-vis the emissions, vis-a-vis their inefficiency, and what we can do to improve that efficiency overall. Thank you.
Thanks, Yesem. And we're just about out of time, so I'll only take one more question off of the app, and it's on a topic that we haven't touched on too much yet, and it's important. The question is the maritime sector workforce ready to handle the more sustainable fuel sources? And the short answer is no. So there's a lot of work to be done. As Taniguchi-san pointed out, there are a number of future fuels that are alternatives. And a lot of debate is going on now. Which fuel will win out? A lot of times, the belief is there won't be a single winner. There's going to be multiple fuels in the future that will have different use cases. So each of these future fuels comes with their own challenges. Ammonia is extremely toxic. Methanol burns invisibly. Extremely dangerous to have a methanol fire that you cannot see. So there's hazards there that need a complete new suite of training for our workforce, and the vast majority of seafarers are from ADB member countries. So we have potential to support new training programs and upskilling the workforce to handle these future fuels. But are they ready today? No. Is that an opportunity? Yes. There's certainly a lot of work to be done, and ADB is ready to support that. Taniguchi, I don't know if you have any thoughts on workforce training that goes along with those fuels that you've researched.
Thank you for the question. It is a very difficult questions for me. So there are so many challenges for decarbonization in shipping industries, including the port and the seafarers and the other sectors. Unfortunately, we are not targeted in the seafarers, but it is also very difficult, very important issues. So we are interested in the areas, and what I mentioned to audience, I believe the key issues is the cross-sectors cooperation, including the ports, shipping industries, other sectors. So we will focus on the whole of the maritime industries collaboration. We want to keep to research. Thank you.
Thank you. And that concludes our session for this afternoon. So I would like to thank all of our speakers for joining us today. Thank you, Yeshem, for joining us virtually. And I would like to especially thank you, the audience, for joining us and spending your 90 minutes with us this afternoon. So thank you very much, and have a wonderful rest of the afternoon, and enjoy the rest of the Transport Forum this week. Thank you.
And thank you, Duncan, for that masterful mediation.